Stolen, written by Verjuices. For as long as I can remember, people at the hospital have accused me of stealing. Everyone at work agreed I was stealing something, but no one could seem to figure out what that something was. No one seemed sure either as to what made them so confident that I was stealing. But they all agreed nonetheless. I was a thief. It started with a nurse accusing me of stealing needles. He claimed that I spent too much time going into rooms alone and acting guilty. But management confirmed a week later that they discovered no missing syringes. Next, I was accused of stealing sponges. This accusation made me laugh. What purpose would I have for stealing sponges? And it was confirmed a week later that all sponges were accounted for. This continued on for weeks. Accusations of missing pens, wallets, patient records, the list went on and on. Every set of items was immediately confirmed to not be missing. Soon, the accusations died down, although no one seemed to believe that I really couldn't be guilty, even when they didn't have the slightest shred of proof. It was just ingrained into their minds that I was the type of guy who stole useless hospital junk. And I didn't. What I stole wasn't junk. I needed to bring it home to sustain myself. Doesn't everyone have the right to food? And besides, who's gonna miss a bunch of amputated body parts? The World's Best Pulled Pork, written by Lillith MkLather on Sukiyaki Kid.
I lived in a small town in Texas, and every summer the food truck would arrive. It wasn't anything expensive to gawk at, with it being built out of a 1980s Ford Ranger truck bed with old wooden slabs. The name of the truck was spray painted on the side in big uneven letters, which was the truck's business name, Mikey's. And it would be a big thing in our town. Yes, it wasn't the prettiest, most pristine business, but it was quite lovable. However, this business winded up ending after about 15 years.
A low, husky voice said. The man was masked by a burlap sack. He set aside a couple of jars by an industrial-sized pot.
They sold fries, several pork and chicken items alongside biscuits and jars of barbecue sauce. I had been going to that truck every summer for 5 years before they shut down. I would grab my wife and kids and would go have lunch there on the 4th of July. We would get pulled pork sandwiches, and I would often salivate at the thought of the sweet yet tangy barbecue sauce, mingling together lightly with the soft, succulent shreds of pork, and the wonderful cloud-soft bun with hints of salt and butter. It became a tradition we would buy the heavenly premium pork every time we went. But last week, we found out that the pork wasn't quite pork. The truck was gone, and we were met with police investigating a crime scene. It was human flesh, and Mike defended himself by stating that they were pigs in behavior, so they were just as worthy.
He said with an awkward pleasure in his tone, a great power in his voice.
But something had to happen. Mike went to prison, of course, and my son asked me for food for Mikey's. And I couldn't refuse the request, especially to a child with cancer.
He said while he approached me, holding a syringe in his left hand. He set it down after he appeared to be considering something.
He didn't know about what Mike did.
He picked up a knife sharpening rod and scraping noises shot through the room for a second, followed by silence. He picked up a large knife and came up to my face and pointed the blade at my forehead while cackling.
Now, what do you have to say on this? Would you let a dying child be upset about not getting his wish? Or will you help me make the world's best pulled pork?
Afterlife, written by Jjustingraham. She died 15 minutes after her 67th birthday. It wasn't painful, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't violent. She ate too much, drank too much, took the pills, went to sleep, and stayed that way. Apart from the vomit that dribbled from her lips, her face looked peaceful, content. She had asked for a green burial, for her body to be composted, which is how it got in. After washing her body, Edward picked one of her favorite dresses, a white lacy thing that she bought the last time they were in Paris. Portersville could use a little Europa, she giggled. She loved it at first, but as the years went by, began to hate how it cut into her softer, flabbier flesh and banished it to the back of the closet. Edward thought, to the end, that she was the sexiest woman he had ever met. Even as the cancer shut her down piece by piece, he wanted to remember that giggle, that joy, so he picked that dress. She was wrapped in a biodegradable cloth and placed in a simple wooden coffin that invited the worms and rot. After a wrenching parade of goodbyes, she was covered in dirt and moss under a pile and left behind. Death stokes fascination and fear because of the termination. Whether you call it a soul or consciousness or being, there is an it, no matter how healthy or deranged or vibrant, that ceases to be at the moment the body goes. There is knowledge, there is memory, there is love, there is pleasure, there is agony and sickness and hatred, animating emotions that collapse when the plug is pulled out of the wall. It is immediate, a cancellation. It finds these things. It finds them in the flesh at first, laying eggs under bloated skin which hatch and run about, rewiring muscles and reanimating blood vessels. The body shivers under the weight of it. The intensity of the cold becomes unbearable until the nerve endings wither and die. The muscles are weak at death and continue to wither with time as it takes to its work. Bowels empty, sex organs deflate and desiccate. Gas fills compartments to bursting. It makes small holes in the flesh, allowing the gas of decomposition to escape without claiming its prize. Not until the work is finished. The brain, the compartment of the soul, is the last stage. By this point of death, there is little left but a single, compromised consciousness with the basest of emotions. It takes these emotions and amplifies them, creating within the host a need to live and an itinerary. The eyes open, but they don't see. But it sees. Edward was shaken with fear when he unlocked the door, but his love made him open it. There is a cancellation of the soul, the being, the consciousness at death. But the living don't know that. It knows that. Hunters, written by FoggyGlassEye. The woods were silent. The hunter watched from the trees as a lone deer wandered into the otherwise empty clearing. The deer considered its surroundings, sniffing the air. The hunter was downwind and remained undetected. Satisfied, the deer bent down to eat some grass. The hunter slowly adjusted his aim, the crosshairs directly over the deer's chest, right at the heart. He placed his finger over the trigger and took a deep breath. The deer stood up and began to bolt across the clearing. Cursing his luck, the hunter switched to his binoculars, knowing he wouldn't be able to land a shot on such a fast target. He followed the fleeing animal as it started towards the woods. It took him a moment to realize that the deer wasn't running away. It was heading in his direction, likely without knowing it. A shadow passed over the clearing, larger than any cast by a bird should be, heading straight for the deer. Before it could reach the woods, the shadow reached the deer, and from above, a bird slammed into it, forcing it to the ground. The deer cried out as massive dark wings surrounded it, and all was quiet again. The hunter tried to get a closer look at the wings through his scope. They were black as midnight, quivering as the bird did, whatever it was doing behind them. The wings were large enough to cover the entire deer. Now, for fear instead of sport, the hunter returned his finger to the trigger, holding his breath. The wings expanded, and the creature stood on hind legs. Beyond the wings, the animal's body was almost human in shape. A thin figure besides enormous wings weren't considered. Their arms and legs ended in 3 long, scaled fingers, with talon-like nails at the end of the digits. The creature had no neck, the head protruding forward from the top end of the torso, almost like a hunchback. As the crosshairs reached the face of the beast, the hunter's lip quivered. It had no beak, instead a lipless opening lined with rows of sharp teeth, wide and triangular like a bear trap. The creature stepped forward, and the ends of its mouth began to curl, almost like a smile.
"Don't worry,"
it growled, staring straight at the hunter with black, lifeless eyes.
"I've already eaten."
The monster flapped its wings, quickly returning to the skies. The hunter didn't bother trying to get a closer look at where it was going. His hands were shaking so bad it just looked blurry anyway. Instead, he continued to look at where it had been. The deer was laying at the edge of the clearing. He couldn't see what other damage the beast had done to it, unable to keep his hands steady. But he could see that the animal's entire head was gone. Setting the gun down, the man got to his feet and walked away, leaving all behind. The woods were silent once more. The Black Car, written by Andrew Scolari. Spencer H. Prescott was not a very nice man. He was mean-spirited, bad-tempered, and all-around obnoxious to almost everyone that so much as looked at him funny. Spencer, while wealthy, didn't find pleasure in the same things that most people his social class did. While most people with millions of dollars enjoyed cocktail parties, attending charity galas, watching tennis and polo matches, or sailing the ocean on their yachts that were practically floating mansions, Spencer derived pleasure at creating misery and being an all-around jerk. Spencer was 6'3", 31 years old, with thick auburn hair, dark gray eyes, 250 pounds of solid muscle, and was the kind of guy that went to sporting events such as baseball, basketball, hockey games just to heckle the players, even if they played on the team he was rooting for. Picked fights with strangers in random bars and shoved panhandlers to the ground. Spencer Harvey Prescott was another privileged, hulking lout. Once he had finished up at a dentist appointment, he saw that the bill was higher than he would have liked. Being the entitled prick he was, Spencer told the dentist he was not paying $57.80 just for 2 cavities filled. He proceeded to shout and yell at the poor man for a good half hour, and drove away 4 waiting patients till the dentist finally caved and only charged Spencer $3.85, 1/15 the price on the bill. But when it came to driving, that was when Spencer was at his worst. Spencer drove a silver customized BMW with a very powerful and loud engine and relished taking full advantage of it. Whenever he came across a slow-moving driver, whether it a 16-year-old kid who just got their driver's license and was experiencing the open road for the first time, or a 80-year-old lady going to visit her grandkids or play cribbage with some friends, Spencer would roar up on the offending driver's bumper and stay there. He'd honk his horn long and loud and often shouted a string of profanities till the driver of the other car either sped up or pulled over and let Spencer by. One autumn night, Spencer was leaving a lounge bar. It was one of the times he didn't start a fight with someone and was making his way across the parking lot when the woman approached him. The woman was around 5'7" and appeared to be in her mid-20s with short, curly blonde hair and blue eyes. She wore a blue coat over a gray sweater, blue jeans, and worn-out sneakers with gray laces. The woman proceeded to tell Spencer that her car had run out of gas a few blocks up the road, but was flat broke and needed to get her dying grandmother into the hospital. She then asked him if he would be so kind as to spare at least $20. Spencer had heard this one before along with several variants and knew this was a standard con used by people too lazy to find a job but didn't fancy standing on the street corners holding a cardboard sign, and Spencer was having none of it. In one swift motion, Spencer gave a hard backhanded slap across the woman's face, sending her sprawling to the pavement. The woman looked up at him holding her already reddened cheek with a look of both fear and shock on her face, before scrambling to her feet and running from the parking lot, sobbing into the darkness. Spencer then got in his car and started his drive home. Spencer lived in a sprawling 3-story McMansion on a semi-secluded estate about 15 miles out of town. As he drove, he thought about the panhandler he had sent crying into the night. "Serves her right," Spencer said to himself with a sadistic laugh. He thought about the woman sitting alone on a stained and ripped couch in a basement apartment, sobbing in misery, holding an ice pack to her cheek with one hand and drinking a Four Loko with the other. Spencer's thoughts were interrupted when his eyes fixated on 2 small red discs in the darkness. They were obviously the taillights of another vehicle, one that was moving very. Spencer grinned. If there was one thing he liked more than fighting in bars, heckling professional athletes, assaulting panhandlers, and bullying people, it was harassing slow drivers. Spencer sped up and, just to be extra annoying, turned on his high beams. The car in front of him was a large, black car that looked to be from the mid to late 1930s, but he couldn't figure out what specific make or model it was. The license plate was old too. It was black with white trim around the perimeter, with no tags or state name, just 3 large white digits that made up the number 998. Spencer peered in frustration at the driver. It appeared to be a very thin-looking man wearing a black wide-brimmed fedora and a black trench coat. The man didn't seem to notice Spencer behind him and kept staring straight ahead. No matter how loud or often Spencer blared his horn or how close he tailgated, the driver of the old car showed no signs of speeding up or pulling over. Finally, Spencer got fed up. He changed lanes and pulled ahead of the slow old car and watched as the 2 white discs that were the car's headlights faded and faded into the distance. A few miles down the road, Spencer was still fuming. He'd find out who the owner of that old car was, and he had a few friends of his that would pay that man a visit. very slowly, about 20 miles per hour in a 55 mile per hour zone. He could see the man coming out of his house or walking into his garage only to find his vintage car destroyed. Spencer pictured the man falling to his knees, sobbing as he beheld what was once an automotive treasure, now a vandalized ruin with dents, broken windows, busted headlights, and covered with graffiti. This brought a smile to Spencer's face, but that smile faded when, rounding a bend, he saw two small red discs. Upon closer inspection, Spencer realized that it was the same old black car. "It can't be," Spencer exclaimed, but it was. Spencer again drew close to the old car's back bumper and began his barrage of harassments and still got no results. Spencer cursed in anger as he pulled alongside the car. Spencer rolled down the passenger side window, and as he looked, he could see the man's dark figure. It was little more than a silhouette, and the driver appeared to be smoking a long, thick cigar, its tip glowing a hellish orange. Spencer leaned forward and shouted, "Hey, Grandpa, get back to whatever nursing home you escaped from and put that old relic in a junkyard where it belongs." And with that, Spencer drove off. Spencer stopped for gas at a small, out-of-the-way gas station. As he filled up the BMW, Spencer scanned the road for the mysterious black car. The only other vehicles Spencer saw were two pickups and a Greyhound bus, but no old black car. Spencer finished gassing up and continued his drive home. He was nearly home and had almost forgotten about his two encounters with the mysterious black car when, cresting a hill, his heart sank. Right in front of him were two very familiar red discs. Spencer already knew the car they belonged to. This time he didn't bother harassing the driver as he knew it would be pointless. Instead, he pulled right alongside the old car and rolled down his window. "Hey, pal, what kind of game are you Spencer's words died in his throat when the driver of the black car turned his head, and Spencer saw his face for the first time. The driver's face was nothing but a bleach white skull. Pale yellow pinpricks of light glowed softly in the skeleton's eye sockets. Spencer stared in speechless horror at what he was seeing. He was so transfixed on the skeleton man that he didn't notice the headlights of the oncoming semi-truck until its horn blared in his ear. But by then, it was too late. While the emergency services were dealing with the remains of Spencer Prescott in the neighboring county, Charlie Dawson sped down the highway in his green 1999 Pontiac Trans Am. The 32-year-old man had just murdered his parents after forcing them to surrender their entire life savings over to him. $13.5 million in my pocket and another small fortune in loot in the trunk, and it's all mine, Charlie said to himself. My brother Peter and sister Joe won't get a penny of it, he continued. He was referring to the check his now late father had hastily made out when he came home and found his ne'er-do-well oldest son, who they thought they got away from, with his wife of 35 years in a chokehold and pointing a gun at her head, demanding all the money they had in the bank, or he'd blow Ma's brains out. 2 dead bodies and a ransacked house to make it look like a burglary gone wrong later, and Charlie was soon speeding towards the state line. His thoughts of what he'd do with his newfound wealth were interrupted when he noticed 2 small red discs in front of him. As he got closer, he saw that it was an old black car from the 1930s. It bore an odd license plate. The license plate was black with white trim around the perimeter and had no tags or state name on it. On it were just 3 large white digits that made up the number 999. Thank you for listening. You can probably handle another horror story, right?